So a little bit more about immigration. This is a brief explainer video about some new immigration policy changes, the usage of the word sanctuary, secular and religious, DACA, sensitive location, dreamer, and prosecutorial discretion for ICE. So California is a sanctuary state. Some states like Texas are not sanctuary states, but they have cities within them like Austin that are sanctuary cities. We'll talk about how the Trump administration is treating those a little bit later. But the way that sanctuary came about was Special Order 40 in LA, 1979. The chief of police was worried about undocumented folks not being able to testify in court cases. The idea being that if you were a bad guy and the only witness against you was undocumented, then you could threaten to report and have deported that undocumented person before justice could be served. So in a sense, the idea of sanctuary came about from police, law and order types that wanted to make sure that the carriage of justice remained sort of intact. And so we see the application is that state and local law enforcement are not allowed to do the federal deportation work. So what this looks like is sheriffs and police departments are not allowed to report the immigration status of people they come in contact with to federal officials. In a sense, they are not required to do the work of federal immigration officials. So California has this in place, but states like Arizona, the police also act as sort of deportation and immigration officials. So it's confusing for an undocumented person to know if they should comply with officials or not. There has been a marked decrease in reporting of crime and of trust in police in states and cities that have police also acting as deportation force. There's been a lot of changes, but one of the biggest changes was the order of deportation enforcement. It's true that Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief. Deportations increased under President Obama, but the priority of deportations was generally for violent criminals. This current administration has flattened out the order of deportations, and so now there's no difference between the likelihood of a violent criminal being deported versus anybody else that's undocumented. So any criminal offense is deportable now. There's no prioritization. You can also have pending criminal charges that will deport you, or committed acts that would be a crime even if they're not through the criminal justice system. If you've committed fraud, for instance, having fake papers that the coyote who brought you over the border would have given you, abused public benefits programs, final order of removal. And the last one's interesting. It's if you're deemed to be a risk to public safety or national security by an immigration officer, so his or her judgment basically, if they think that you should be deported, you basically have to be deported. Now, you may have heard another usage of the term sanctuary. In the 1980s, there was a sanctuary movement in which churches, mostly Catholic churches, were harboring Central American refugees. The U.S. government had made it more difficult for Central Americans to seek asylum, and so they were holing up inside churches, and priests were barring the federal government from coming inside and removing them and deporting them. And it was effective. It was a political strategy that was effective. It looked so bad to be sort of pushing priests aside, handcuffing them, jailing them, so you could deport people back to their war-torn countries, that since then there's a memorandum of understanding with ICE that says basically, although it's not illegal to pull people from inside churches and schools and hospitals, they generally try really hard not to do it, right? They don't want people not to go to school or not to go to the hospital or not to go to church. So these are sensitive locations, and there are currently undocumented immigrants being housed inside churches around the U.S. for this reason, but they cannot leave, or else they'll basically be deported by the ICE agents waiting outside. Side note, the church I was going to 2 years ago had a request from a family seeking this sort of sanctuary, and we weren't able to pull anything together in time. Another term that shows up a lot is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's basically something put into place by President Obama as an executive order in the face of the consistent failure of comprehensive immigration reform in Congress. Something like 70% of Americans would like to see comprehensive immigration reform so that the path to citizenship is clearer, but that keeps not happening. So presidents take executive actions, and this is one of them. There was actually a sister program called DAPA, Deferred Action for Parental Arrivals, but that was not signed into law. The DREAM Act was also not passed. So this is the one thing that Obama was able to do, and it provides sort of temporary protection from deportation for young people that were brought to the U.S. before the age of 16. It is not a path to lawful permanent residence, but it's just sort of temporary protection. So here's some more information on DACA. I pulled it from Wikipedia. It's a decent summary. Please know everything in bold. There, of course, have been a lot of political machinations in the last few years. This current administration is going back and forth about DACA, and a lot of it is political manipulation, but we expect the Supreme Court to decide on the constitutionality of DACA by summer 2020. Again, please make sure you are familiar with the information in bold. Some very recent news on sanctuary. Starting when Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General, California and other sanctuary states and cities were sued to try to prevent them from receiving any federal funds around this stuff because they were not cooperating with federal immigration enforcement officials. And as another sort of evidence of the war between federal government and states on this issue, on the right, you see the Border Patrol will deploy basically SWAT teams for immigration into places like LA, San Francisco, to override these state and cities' desire to keep law enforcement separate from federal deportation, and in general to sort of protect their undocumented people that live in their areas. And finally, basically, this flattening of deportation procedures and protocols, now not prioritizing violent criminals but sort of deporting lots more, has overwhelmed the ability of ICE. And so, more money is going into ICE to build it up, but also as a stopgap measure of some sort, ICE agents are now given a lot more discretion about who they can deport. And it's interesting, remember that as long as an ICE agent believes you are a threat, you can basically deport it. So there's no proof necessary except the judgment of the ICE officer.